So we spent a lot of time sending our staff into remote areas and deploying this tech, figuring out how to make it work. And we've developed a powerful method for engaging with field partners on how to ensure positive outcomes for any given project. This typically starts with understanding what the challenges a given protected area is facing. So we engage in quite a lot of dialogue and understanding of what those issues are, whether it's human-wildlife conflict, poaching, invasive species, or other things. Secondly, we think a lot about what kind of power solutions are going to be required for any technology that's deployed in the field. And in order to really facilitate the real-time aspects of this, we go ahead and figure out a data retrieval plan, or how do we get connectivity into a given space. Finally, we think a lot about the sensors that are deployed, what is going to detect the information and answer the questions that the people on the ground need in order to make an appropriate response. And then finally, we spend even more time thinking about how to engage with partners and really operationalize the technology, because if you are just deploying technology for the sake of tech, oftentimes it will fall over quite quickly, or it won't become a true solution. You need to actually figure out how to incorporate that into the conservation practices that the field partner is really working with. And so we focus a lot on that, and then building long-term relationships with all of the groups that we're working with. For us, this has meant working a lot with a variety of different cameras and camera systems. So there is no particular hardware that we're accustomed to. We rather say that you can bring a patchwork of different types of tech and create a solution that will ultimately have a positive outcome. Likewise, for connectivity, oftentimes we find ourselves communicating with camera networks through local cellular networks, through private radio networks in areas where there is no cell signal, or even point-to-point and point-to-multipoint systems communicating through Wi-Fi. And now with the rise of Starlink, that's increasingly in the mix as well. So once we have kind of the sensor in place and the connectivity solution, at that point the data can flow into a variety of different AI algorithms. And we have a platform that can analyze inbound imagery that can look for things like vehicles where they don't belong, or people where they don't belong, or increasingly now looking at the ecological monitoring side of things and recognizing animals and eventually species and other types of information as well. Once this data is flowing, it can go globally, and that gives you a lot of power and flexibility. Most typically, our partners are implementing the front lines with the information they need most, and having the information flow to the rangers in the field if they have any sort of connectivity or alerting capability. That can happen through email, SMS, WhatsApp, what have you. Many times our partners also have a operations center where that data needs to surface as well. But ultimately, this can also flow into big data repositories, so things like SMART and EarthRanger, so that the information can be stored, cataloged, analyzed, and impact future planning operations. But the main idea here is that we want to meet people wherever they are, whether it's someone with a cell phone in the field, or someone in a planning center, or a remote parks office, or even a headquarters or a ministry. That's where we focus on surfacing this data. A few use cases that I like to highlight that when we really got into this, we figured cameras for anti-poaching, traditional security approach. That makes a lot of sense, but the field has provided a lot of deeper insights, because when you give field conservationists a tool, they will always find incredible ways to apply it and use it in ways you never thought of. So I'd like to surface some of those for you today, and perhaps some apply to your context. If you're interested in them, I'd love to chat with you more about any or all of these opportunities. One is simple protection of gated areas, flow control of who's coming and going from a protected area. A second is protection of infrastructure. This was a camera that was actually set up to monitor the base of cell phone towers, which are occasionally the victims of vandalization or theft. A third use case that has surprised us is traffic control. In the Masai Mara, we paired our cameras with radar detectors for speed traps, and rangers were able to get real-time alerts that someone was speeding and then see the vehicle so they could make an interdiction. This actually ended up saving them quite significantly on road repair that they had to do, which means conservation dollars can flow in areas that are not road maintenance or access related. We've been surprised by the fact that our cameras have saved people. This image from Nepal was actually a hiker who was lost, and fortunately they happened across a field camera that was deployed for snow leopard monitoring, and they were able to be rescued because of that. So, interesting use case. Fire detection has been a side benefit for deploying a network of over 2,000 cameras globally. And so there are certainly satellite devices or satellite feeds that provide fire detection data, but oftentimes people are tuned into visuals, and the camera networks can be powerful for that. Understanding microclimate conditions is another use case. We had a group in Hawaii who would routinely dispatch helicopters to high elevations and then have to turn around because they couldn't land due to lack of visibility. And of course, the fuel costs associated with that is troublesome and impactful to their budget. So with camera networks, they can see, is it a good day to fly? Can we accomplish the mission we need to? And be successful in that regard. Monitoring remote locations, specifically things like borehole status and what animals are visiting that and at what frequency, is oftentimes a use case that people are interested in. And then turning to more covert or surveillance related use cases here, this I like to bring up as an example of what you can do with regard to hiding trap cameras. Oftentimes it's a concern that people may steal them. There's quite an amount of bushcraft that can be applied so that you can reduce this threat and maintain your network in the long term without having to constantly be purchasing cameras. So a lot that can be done there. Preventing zoonotic disease is one aspect for these types of networks. This gentleman is extracting guano from a bat cave in Jamaica. So being able to monitor that sort of thing and make appropriate reactions or measures to reduce this sort of transhumance is powerful to be able to do. We also have groups who use the cameras for monitoring rare and endangered species. This is a mariqui in Brazil, and the use case for the cameras here that requires real time is that they actually put the cameras in the canopy, and when the cameras are detected, because the mariqui move around, the researchers know to come out, put up a drone in the air because they'll be there for the next day or two, and they can get proper counts of these roving species of monkeys. Invasive species detection, and then even animal health and welfare. We've had groups who have identified, for example, this leopard that had a snare around its neck. The sharp-eyed rangers identified that as an issue. They set up a trap and a camera to monitor that so as to not disturb the animal going in and taking the bait. And they were able to save that animal through veterinary care. And then, of course, there's the traditional security aspects that we had always considered. And cameras, especially real-time cameras, can help the collection of information and rapidly evolve your understanding of pattern of life. For example, this fellow was coming into a protected area 6 in the morning in a place where there were little patrols going on. The following day he was there with a tracker, and by the third day we understood that the 6 in the morning this person is coming in and engaging in illicit activities within the park itself. So we coordinated with the wardens, they repositioned the cameras, and the next day we were actually able to see the chase go down on the camera, and they were able to make an appropriate interdiction on the bushmeat poachers. And then, of course, the use case that we had always considered, which was proactive response to evolving situations, where you have high target species. We engage with groups who help us identify places that they know they would like to be monitoring 24/7. We can wire those up, and in this particular park, within 2 weeks, we were able to identify 2 spotters followed by a rifleman there for rhinos. In this particular instance, because we had cooperated with the local NGO and they did not have a 24-hour operations room, they had agreed to allow us to also provide supplementary monitoring remotely from our headquarters in Colorado. This image was actually caught by our team in Denver, and because we followed the agreed upon operating procedures, we were able to get a hold of the warden and activate their teams to roll out into the field, which we saw within a matter of about 15 minutes. This actually resulted in a firefight between the parties. Fortunately, no one was killed or injured, but it did prompt the poachers to flee the area. They did drop all their material, and we were able to see the post-crime scene analysis in real time there as well. So an interesting example of how real-time networks and technology can enable a global conservation response and a positive ultimate outcome. We also are using the same technology for human-wildlife conflict deterrence. The idea here is that you use the same cameras, the same AI, looking for animals in this case as opposed to people. And we can then send signals out through SMS to activate devices in field, whether that's sounds, lights, electronic flashes, all sorts of different things, and then concurrently send alerts out directly to the community so they can marshal a manual response as well. A couple key factors for success in thinking about these types of real-time networks. Always begin with informed deployment of where you think that sensor needs to go. And the people who know that best are the ones who are on the ground and have been working there. Paying close attention to battery levels is key. I can tell you that if you are not using solar panels, you probably have about half of your sensors not working at any given time. And the data has borne that out time after time. Put data subscriptions on automatic renewal, because just like you run out of power, you also run out of data, and any sort of sensor that's not communicating is effort wasted. Be clear of who is monitoring, where and when, and what to do when something is seen. Those operating procedures and really making this a part of your ongoing operations is key. Finally, monitoring and maintaining the network. There are and will always be ants digging into the tech, elephants crushing it, people stealing it. You can mitigate that to an extent, but it's always good to have extra parts and pieces. And then finally, take advantage of the data interchange capabilities. Make sure that the information being collected by your cameras is being surfaced in SMART. And you are likewise considering your patrol planning and patterns in relation to the cameras. If you know you have an asset that's monitoring a certain pass 24/7, you can reroute your patrols to focus on areas that don't have that same capability. With that, I would like to welcome to the stage Andy Wallace to chat with you about satellite data, and we will take questions afterwards.
So thank you very much for that, Eric. I work for a company called Atos, and we're an IT company, so I'm slightly in awe of the audience here who have got so much more knowledge than I have about the real world where you guys all work. We are doing a piece of work with WWF. I'm project manager for a couple of those projects. I'll talk, if anybody's here, at 2 o'clock about some of the wider context of the work we're doing. But for this session, I just want to talk about one project where we've asked the question, can we use satellite imagery plus AI for beginning to monitor some areas where there's a great deal of biodiversity? So the people we're working with, I mentioned the partnership with WWF. This particular project was initiated by a group called the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership. the BirdLife International, for example, running the secretariat of that group from Cambridge University in the UK. And I heard the keynote this morning that area, this issue of biodiversity monitoring mentioned as really a key factor in supporting policymakers in the future. That group of 13 amazing conservation organizations are busy mapping some of the areas around the globe with the greatest biodiversity. They're up to about 16,800 and counting across 7 continents and all of the oceans. But we chose to look at East Africa because working with WWF in Kenya, they had a lot of knowledge. I've already met some of you in the audience today who've got far more knowledge than I will ever have. But the objective we set ourselves was, could we build an automated solution to try and identify some of the changes that are happening to those grassland environments over time by bringing satellite imagery and machine learning and artificial intelligence together. Out of everything I've learned in the last 24 hours, I kind of wish I was going to say some different stuff, because those of you who were in the session this morning are about to see the fact that my team has fallen into many of the pitfalls that you're warning us against, but never mind, I'm just going to keep going with it. So our pilot area is around the Kenya-Tanzania border area. We're working with Planet to provide satellite imagery. And our original project scope was to really pose the question, could we look at about 30,000 square kilometers of habitat? But being a good IT person, my starting point was, let's start a little bit smaller, try and get the skeleton of a process working, and then once we've got some automation happening, then let's scale up and see what we can do with it. So we made a decision as a group of people, my organization working with WWF and their colleagues, and pulling in academics from universities in the UK and in Southern Africa and North America, and we kind of made the choice to just start out looking in the Amboseli area, where we begin, having defined the area, to start trying to identify the best source of satellite imagery. So we did our initial proof of concept work in the Google platform, and we're currently porting it to Planet as we speak. And we started trying to think about how we might run a family of algorithms to ask questions about habitat condition. So much has been said in the last day or two in this conference about listening to people in the field. Of course, I'm leading a group of IT professionals from Northern Europe and India and North America who simply don't have that field experience. So we've had to do a lot of listening. I've done even more listening in the last 24 hours, and we'll end up tweaking things a little bit. But the first thing we started doing, and so I'm going to cover 3 algorithms which we've built and are currently chaining together and trying to get to work at scale, is trying to read in images which we've downloaded from different satellite platforms. So we took about 1,000 1-kilometer square images out of that roughly 10,000 square kilometers and got a group of volunteers to start labeling them. So some things, like buildings, we labeled a little less than 10% of those by putting images out and having groups of people from our own organization and others just looking at them and saying what they could see and using those as tags to feed in to a learning algorithm, and then quite quickly realized that if we combined, and for those of you in, I'm sure this room has got a great mix of people who understand technology quite deeply and who work in the field and don't really come anywhere near it, but I will touch on some of the techniques we're using. So there are algorithms which we can go get off the shelf, which kind of recognize shapes already. Some of the round structures that we put in a pre-trained algorithm came back, and the commercially available or free tools are saying, ooh, I wonder if it's a clock. Well, no, it's a circular structure just on the Tanzania side of the border. But gradually by training it, the algorithm started to see with a level of confidence, and the percentage you see on this are the output from our proof of concept, that says that algorithm is now measuring itself at 90%, whereas when it starts to look at a fence, that's a harder structure to see because of the linear nature of it. And so we're getting slightly lower percentages. We've done another test in the Daycatcher Hills area, looking for some slightly different structures in conversation with others here, such as Drew from WWF. We realize that when we go and move to other ecosystems, such as the Mara ecosystem, we will need to retrain that algorithm. We'll need to use on-the-ground expertise. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is bring together the expertise of our technical community from a tech company with people on the ground, and so we're always looking for new and better ways to try and bring real expertise to the people who don't really get out into the bush very often. So that's algorithm 1. I mentioned 3. For those of you in the meeting room this morning, you will have heard that the platforms that are being discussed working alongside EarthRanger and SMART already have some interfaces into vegetation indexes such as the NDVI. I confess we've gone and built some stuff, so that's some of the duplication you were being warned of this morning. But we're now writing algorithms which can look into the planet platform, read back over the last 5 years, which I understand from my ecologically minded colleagues has not been a typical 5 years, and in sort of 3 meter by 3 meter pixel squares, start to understand the trend over the last 5 years, and that gives rise to our third algorithm. And if I press the right button, the little animation will run here. So what we're then building are the underlying data structures where we can look at a monthly reading in small tiles. Initially, we're going for about 30 meters by about 30 meters, right across this whole area, so that we can begin to create a record of the values in history, create the mean and standard deviation or any other statistical measures of those, and then going forward, and what we've got on here is test data rather than actual data, is to, as we start to think into the future and take measurements on a monthly basis from Planet or potentially different satellite platforms, we can then pose the question, are we within historical records for this particular area? Are we seeing the right kind of greenness at the right time of year? And then, again, I heard somebody else talk about looking for anomalies in the talk this morning, and we've borrowed from some of our colleagues who work in manufacturing ideas about predictive maintenance. Can you fix engines before they break? Can you fix things? I think somebody talked about voltages on collars this morning. That's something we see a lot in the railway industry, of actually looking at voltages on a set of points or on a railway track to try and understand what sort of fluctuations are precursors to failure. So we're going to borrow those technologies from other industries outside of the world of conservation and try and bring them to say, if we can see abnormal greenness, what does that mean? Does it correlate with seasonal or unseasonal rainfall? Might it mean somebody is irrigating? If we're seeing less than we would expect, is it going to recover afterwards, or are we seeing conversion of habitat or overgrazing for other reasons? And we're going to start to build fire pattern into this model as well. So that will all ultimately turn into a user interface. This is one of the slides that I would not have put into this talk if I had been listening to this morning's conversations before doing it. I've got a team of people about to start building this. This is a mock-up where we're thinking how we can bring all of those data points from the 3 different algorithms to try and create some kind of predictor that says 0 out of 1 means humans are really leaving that area alone and it's in quite good condition. 1 out of 1 means it's a city center and somebody's been trampling all over it for years. And in between those, what's really interesting is, what is the rate of change? Are we starting to see anomalies where you don't expect them? Because, of course, we do understand that there are people out there working in the field who've got so much more knowledge than we ever will have. So what's important is that we can try and come up with some kind of predictive engine that says, are we starting to see degradation of habitat either because of more infrastructure or less greenness or more fire or less fire or whatever those ecological parameters are that might cause us to want to take some kind of intervention? And based on what I've learned this morning, I'm now asking myself, do I go back to the UK next week and start getting people to build this, or do I start talking to some of the people who presented this morning about just feeding those data points into interfaces that other people are building? So watch this space. I have a feeling that based on everything I've learned, I might be changing track a little bit, but that is the brief view. I've got my very last slide, talks a little bit about benefits. It was kind of written for an audience of not conservation people, so bear with me if there's anything naive in this, but our user group are the Biodiversity Areas Partnership. We believe that NGOs and governments will find this of great value. We think that local conservation organizations will do so. And what we really want to build is a platform that can scale. If we can get it working in those ecosystems, those grassland ecosystems in East Africa, can we move it to other grassland ecosystems across Africa or in other areas? Can we repurpose those algorithms to do other things? Because our thinking as IT people is if we tweak the inputs, we can get different kinds of outputs and begin to use the same platform for different purposes. So that's a very brief overview. At 2 o'clock, I'll be providing a slightly wider view of the program of work that we've started doing with WWF, but hopefully that's enough for Eric and I to go into a bit of a Q&A. I'm hoping they're all for him, by the way.
Yes.
My question is to the second speaker.
Damn.
The problem that I have with NDVI is that, especially in a savanna landscape, it's a balance between your herbaceous layer and your woody layer. And just an increase in greeners,
Repeat the whole thing, right. Right, firstly, thank you for the presentation. My question is with regard to NDVI, specifically for the savanna landscape, which is a balance between your herbaceous and your woody layers. An increase in greenness that might not necessarily indicate, or it might not show the change in your composition. For instance, if there's overgrazing in the landscape, it could increase your woody matter, but your NDVI won't necessarily pick that up. What's your solutions to that, or where's the science at now?
Sure.
Because that's one thing that I've struggled with in the past.
Okay. So our thinking, and bear in mind we're tech people coming new to this world that many people here understand far more deeply than we do. Again, we've borrowed some knowledge from some of our colleagues who work in crop science. So for example, the greenness of a crop of barley and wheat in North America during a green phase is very, very similar. And during a harvest or post-harvest phase is very similar. Where those two things differ is their time signature over the year. So our thinking is if we can carve up those large areas of thousands or even tens of thousands of square kilometers into very small squares, obviously with enormous data storage, we can build quite a fingerprint for each small patch. And so we're not saying, is it the greenness of grassland or a different type of system? We're saying, is it the greenness associated with that area based on its historical pattern? And then by trying to create some probability model that says, how different is it from what you would expect it to be, we can then try and create an alerting system that says, we don't know what's going on, but we do recommend that somebody focuses on that rather than something which does look very normal, if that helps. This one will be for you.
Other questions? Yes, in the back, and then...
Yeah, just a very practical one. You mentioned elephants crushing your cameras. In my experience, actually, what's been the cause of the loss of the most cameras are wildfires. So decent cameras that are fireproof, that a wildfire can go over that wouldn't leave it destroyed, would be something to think about if it doesn't exist already.
Yes, you're right. The wildfire is a danger to the cameras. There's not much that you can do about that. You know, the one benefit of real-time cameras is that they can at least provide you some alert to the fact that the fire is getting close, so you can potentially marshal a response to the general area. The other thing that we're constantly doing is looking for ways to drive costs out and down with the cameras that we're using. So if they do go up in smoke, you know, it's a matter of a couple $100 as opposed to something more serious than that.
Yeah, I suppose that's sensible. And the second part is just, I mean, I'm sure you don't have an answer for this, but where we are in Yassa, it's a vast reserve which has got virtually no connectivity whatsoever. We don't have the LoRa network or anything like that, so for us to have real-time cameras is pretty difficult, if not, or a real-time feed rather, is not currently feasible. How do you see that changing in the future with more cost-effective options for being able to connect individual units in the field to a network and then feed back to your control room?
Great question. The question was, for areas that do not have cellular connectivity, what options are there? And I'm pleased to say that we're really on the brink of what I think is going to be a renaissance of capability in this space. For one, you can pretty much purchase now a Starlink mobile system, and that gives you a base of operation that can be forward positioned almost anywhere and powered by solar, especially if you have the subscription that allows you to move it around. From there, we have technology that is off the shelf that can radiate that signal very far distances. Right now, it's somewhat expensive, but we have just implemented the first instance of a tool that is much less costly than the ones that we've traditionally used for that just this past month in South Africa. After we have that running for a few months, since we've been testing it for about 1.5 years, we'll declare that ready to go. And then one of our preferred camera providers has also come up with a much less expensive approach to this as well, which we're also testing. So between Starlink being able to pop connectivity almost anywhere you can imagine and the ability to radiate signal from that, you can do quite a lot. And just for a little bit of perspective on scale, in systems where we have radiated signal out, we've been upwards of 15 kilometers between a tower and a camera and still had half signal at the camera side. So that's pretty good connectivity. Of course, this was in a bushveld context, not the center of a rainforest, and obviously topology and vegetation greatly affect radio signals, but we're getting there.
All right, thank you very much.
There's a question here.
Thank you. I'm going back to the NDVI discussion, and maybe just to mention that in Namibia we have a platform, Namibia Rangelands, where we actually get the NDVI deviation compared on a decade basis from, let's say, now to compared to last year, to last decade, to last 4 years, which is actually quite a useful tool. I thought I'd mention it in case anyone wants to have a look, because it gives you that picture spatially as a picture of deviation rather than just NDVI.
I would love to learn more about that afterwards. I've got some people thinking about how trying to solve that exact problem, and we're kicking around some ideas now, so if you've already solved it, I would love to reuse your work. Thank you very much. Was there another question here? I can see a camera.
Yes, so I want to know, because I've seen you have, for the satellite imagery, you tested it on the satellite, or have you tested it in the tropical rainforest and see how effective it is? Yeah, I can go over. You mentioned, I saw on your slide that you tested the satellite imagery, like in the savanna lands, but what I want to know is how effective it is in the tropical rainforest.
So one of the reasons why the project was scoped to look at savanna and rangeland, again on advice that we received from the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership, was initially the view that deforestation is quite well served by alerts by systems such as Global Forest Watch and others which already exist, and there was felt to be a gap in mountain areas and in grassland areas where it was probably more likely that we'd be building things that had not been done before. But having said that, what I don't know is if we're trying to look for really fine-level detail in tropical rainforest areas, such as human-made structures rather than deforestation. I'm aware of one research group who's been doing something similar in Brazil in riverine environments, trying to look for buildings going up on riverbanks in tropical forest areas, and they're using very, very similar techniques. I spoke to them a little bit just before we got started. I'm sure there's plenty happening, but that's rather a long way of saying I don't know the answer to your question, sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, right here.
Thank you. I want to ask a small question about the real-time camera trapping. Did you thought about the data sink, where the data are going?
Of people. Other questions? All right, we thank you very much. Oh, there's one question. I'm sorry.
So on the satellite thing, yeah, I'm curious to know how the resolution of your satellite, because if you're saying you use it for ecological monitoring, and do you have when you want to find, for example, a certain species of an animal, for example, a gravy, yeah, we are told that they have different kind of markings, so they say that imagery data is not enough to tell the kind of species that you want and the number and how different they are from each other. So this is in terms of you're told to go for a survey and you find that it's a bit tiresome when you're doing the count of 1 to a certain number. But if you had a resolution that could assist to do that, then...
So the question about resolution of the satellites, so I think the short answer to your question is the satellite imagery we will be using will never be good enough to recognize individual animals. So for example, the planet has a number of different instruments. The one we're using is about 4.5 meters for a pixel. So that means that an image of this stage would be about 6 or 12 pixels or something like that. So it would be quite grainy. And you know, if you put an individual animal in that space, you would just see one square of a slightly different color. You would not even know that it was an animal. So, and some of the greenness pixels that come from the infrared are even wider scope. So some of the older satellites are about 60 meters per pixel, so that might be 4 pixels in this conference room. So it's a balancing act that we have. We think we can see buildings, roads, clearances, water holes, linear structures. We're going to need to do some more work because a narrow fence will not show up in a small image, but we might pick it up on a much larger image. But I don't think our system working this way will ever work on individual animals. What we do think is that working with platform providers, we can be a data source looking top down into that platform, and if the same computer system sitting either on cloud or server, depending on data protection rules in the country where it's operating, we can then use the technology of the platforms, such as was described by Eric and the people this morning, to then add those images, not from the satellite, but from the camera traps or the other sources, so that we've got those locations in the same places. So I think it's the ability of the platform to combine those two data sources that will really help. I don't know if that answers the question.
My question is, have you tried it anywhere within the landscapes that you have worked with so that now you can certify to us that, yeah, it has really worked?
So testing the quality of the predictions on the ground is probably our next phase. So what we've done is we've made photographs available in groups of about 1,000 to people who do know those landscapes intimately. But I think ultimately, before we could stand here and say, yes, our predictions are accurate, we would really need people on the ground to confirm that, and we've not yet done that.
All right, I think we may have one final minute if there's a last question.
Yes, I see you have a deeper understanding of a number of technologies. I just want to maybe check from your experience, what are some of the larger conservation areas where there is a combination of different technologies, trap cameras, satellite imagery, where we could draw some lessons in terms of best practices, if you can advise?
Certainly. We recently engaged in a technology assessment in partnership with folks from Wildlife Conservation Society and EarthRanger, and actually had the opportunity to visit some of the more tech-forward locations that we were all aware of. The areas that I would cite would be what's happening in the Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya, Lewa area, doing an outstanding job with a LoRa network that's connected the better part of 1/3 of the country of Kenya out that way, and they're doing things with EarthRanger tracking as well as a little bit with cameras. The greater Kruger area and the various both national park and private locations there have a wonderful network of the ability to share information across, and of course are doing quite a lot with surveillance and patrol planning and things of that nature. Those are the ones that spring immediately to mind. There are probably many others that I'd be happy to chat with you about more in specific relation to any ideas or context you may have questions about. Thank you all.